engine was the only companion Charlie had as he drove his 18-wheeler through the endless dark stretch of Highway 34. It was a moonless night, and the headlights barely cut through the fog that clung to the road like a warning. Charlie was used to long hauls. He'd been driving trucks for nearly 2 decades, and he'd seen all kinds of strange things on the road. But that night, something felt different, uneasy. He could almost feel eyes watching him from the shadows that lay thick between the trees on either side of the road. The dispatcher's voice had crackled over the CB earlier that night, warning him about some road work that might slow him down. "Expect some delays," they'd said. But when he'd reached the area marked on his route, there were no signs of any construction, just that thick fog and an unusual, almost oppressive silence. The usual sounds of insects or distant animal calls were absent, just the steady hum of his own rig and the occasional groan of the engine. Charlie flicked on the radio, hoping for a little company, but every station was just static. Frustrated, he clicked it off and settled back into his seat, fingers tapping nervously against the wheel. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone. He caught himself checking the rearview mirror more often than usual, as if expecting to see someone in the darkness of his empty truck bed. A flicker of movement in the road ahead broke his trance, and he slammed on the brakes. The truck's wheels screeched, and he lurched forward, gripping the wheel as the massive vehicle came to a shuddering stop. For a moment he sat there, heart pounding, scanning the fog ahead. Had he just imagined it? It had looked like a figure, a person, he thought, darting across the road. But now, there was nothing. Just a faint, ghostly mist swirling in his headlights. With a sigh, Charlie started the truck again and continued down the road, but now his mind was on high alert. His eyes scanned the foggy night with increasing intensity. He'd heard stories of phantom hitchhikers and shadowy figures that wandered back roads, but he'd never put much stock in them. After all, he'd driven these roads for years and had never experienced anything he couldn't explain away. But then, it happened again. Another figure, this time a bit clearer, standing still in the middle of the road. He braked, hard, and squinted through the windshield. It looked like a woman, dressed in a tattered dress, her hair hanging loosely over her face. She was standing perfectly still, staring straight at him. Charlie felt a chill crawl up his spine. He honked the horn, expecting her to move, but she didn't flinch. She just stood there, as if waiting. Charlie felt a strange, almost magnetic pull to the figure, but he forced himself to look away. "Keep it together, Charlie," he muttered to himself, gripping the wheel tightly. When he looked back up, she was gone. He blinked, leaning forward, peering into the fog, but there was no sign of her, just an empty road stretching ahead. The silence was heavier now, pressing down on him, filling the cab with an almost suffocating weight. He could feel his heartbeat racing, hear his own breathing loud in his ears. Whatever that had been, he didn't want to stick around to find out more. He pressed down on the accelerator, eager to put as much distance between himself and that strange apparition as possible. As the miles ticked by, Charlie's nerves began to settle, and he tried to convince himself it had all been in his head. He'd been working long hours after all, and lack of sleep could play tricks on the mind. But just as he started to relax, he felt a chill pass through the truck, as if a cold wind had seeped through the windows. That's when he noticed the smell. A sickly, sweet odor, faint at first, but growing stronger, filling the cab with an almost unbearable stench. It was the smell of decay. Charlie gagged, rolling down the window to let in some fresh air, but the smell clung to him, wrapping around him like a cloud. He fought the urge to pull over, to get out of the truck, but something deep inside told him that stopping would be a mistake. His hands shook as he gripped the wheel, and then he heard it, the faintest whisper coming from the back of the truck. His pulse quickened. It was impossible. He knew he was alone, but the whisper grew louder, a soft, echoing voice that sent chills down his spine. He couldn't make out the words, but it was a voice filled with sadness, and something darker, something almost vengeful. Charlie swallowed hard, his throat dry, and forced himself to keep his eyes on the road. The whispers grew louder, joined by the sound of soft footsteps, as if someone was walking up the length of his truck bed. Slowly, deliberately. His mind raced. He wanted to pull over to leap out of the cab, but his body was frozen, gripped by an inexplicable fear. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The silence returned, thick and unnerving. But the smell of decay still lingered, clinging to the air around him. He didn't dare look back. He knew somehow that if he turned around, he'd see something he didn't want to see. Something that might keep him rooted in place. Forever. Desperate for some sense of normalcy, he reached for the CB radio, his hand shaking as he clicked it on. "This is Big Charlie," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Anyone out there?" Static crackled, and for a moment he thought there'd be no reply. But then a voice came through, faint and distant. "You're not alone, Big Charlie." The voice was low, filled with a kind of hollow emptiness that chilled him to the bone. "You shouldn't have taken this road." Charlie's grip tightened and he could feel the sweat trickling down his forehead. Who is this?" The voice didn't respond directly, but he heard faint laughter, an eerie, echoing sound that made his skin crawl. "You can't escape." Not this time. His heart pounded as the static cut out, leaving him alone once more. But the silence felt more ominous now, as if something was waiting, biding its time. He pressed down on the accelerator, the truck roaring as he sped down the empty road, the fog seeming to close in around him like a shroud. Finally, after what felt like hours, he spotted a faint glow on the horizon, the dim lights of a gas station. Relief washed over him as he pulled into the lot, parking the truck and cutting the engine. He sat there for a moment, catching his breath, still half expecting the whispers to start up again. But there was only silence. He climbed out of the truck, the cool night air a welcome relief, and made his way into the gas station. The cashier behind the counter looked up as he entered, giving him a strange look. "Long night?" she asked, her voice low and wary. "You have no idea," he muttered, reaching for a bottle of water. As he turned back to the counter, he caught sight of a poster on the wall behind her, filled with faded photographs and names. His heart skipped a beat. There, among the faces, was the woman he'd seen in the road, her eyes hollow and distant. The cashier followed his gaze, nodding slowly. "She was a regular on this route," she said quietly. "Died in an accident on this road about 10 years back. Some say she never left." Charlie's hand shook as he set the bottle down, swallowing hard. Is that real?" he managed to ask. The cashier nodded solemnly. "Truckers say she still wanders these roads looking for someone to keep her company." Charlie felt a shiver crawl up his spine, the weight of what he'd experienced settling over him. He thanked the cashier and hurried back to his truck, eager to leave that place behind. But as he climbed back into the cab and started the engine, he noticed something in the rearview mirror. A faint shape, standing at the edge of the fog, watching him with hollow eyes. And as he drove away, the whispers began again, soft and haunting, promising that one day he'd return to this lonely stretch of road, and when he did, she'd be waiting. Jake Ellison had been trucking for nearly 20 years. He liked the quiet of the open road, the hum of the engine, and the steady rhythm of the miles passing beneath his wheels. But tonight felt different. There was an unsettling quiet hanging over the desert highway, stretching into the vast darkness around him. It was 2 a.m., and he was navigating one of those endless stretches of Arizona highway. No cars, no lights. Just his headlights slicing through the thick, oppressive dark. The solitude was soothing, until, out of nowhere, he saw faint truck lights appear in his rearview mirror. At first, he brushed it off. Another trucker, out to make time on this empty road. But something about the headlights seemed off. They were dim, like they belonged to a truck older than he'd ever seen on the road. Jake squinted, shook his head, and refocused on the route, telling himself it was nothing. Minutes passed, and another set of headlights joined the first. Then another. Jake noticed they seemed to form a line, trailing him with a precision that felt unnatural, perfectly synchronized. He reached for the CB radio, trying to shake the eerie silence. Ground voice a little rougher than usual. "This is Wildcard. Anyone out there?" Only static answered him, thick and empty. He tried again, louder. Still nothing. Without warning, yet another truck joined the convoy behind him. Then another. Jake felt a chill crawl up his spine. They were too uniform, too precise, like a line of shadows. He glanced back. The trucks' shapes were murky in the dim moonlight, softened just enough to hide their details, but he could tell. They were old, relics of a different era. He tried to dismiss the thought. Maybe it was some group of vintage truck enthusiasts. Yeah, that had to be it. But his hands tightened on the wheel. With each mile, the line grew. 5 trucks now, all in perfect formation, silent as ghosts. An uneasy weight pressed against his chest, a feeling he'd rarely felt in 20 years on the road. He pushed the gas pedal a little harder, hoping to pull ahead to leave them behind. But the trucks matched his speed, headlights cold and steady, like shadows locked to his own. He gripped the CB radio again, his voice breaking with tension. "This is Wildcard. Anyone out there? What's with the convoy?" The static hissed back at him, then, faintly, a voice broke through. Crackling, distant, just a low murmur over the static. He strained to catch the words, but they slipped through, lost in the noise. That's when he noticed their license plates. As his headlights flickered across the convoy, he squinted, realizing the plates were covered in grime, their designs ancient, like they hadn't seen daylight in decades. Each one seemed to hold faded numbers, scratched and barely legible, rusted right into the metal. His heart sank as he realized these trucks were relics, ghosts, rigs that had vanished over the years, their drivers lost, gone. Panic flickered in his chest. He tried to speed up to shake them, but the convoy held, pacing him with a precision that felt almost intentional. He glanced at the rearview mirror, feeling a heavy, unnatural dread. These trucks weren't just following him, they were waiting for something. Suddenly the radio burst to life, louder this time. He could almost make out the words, "Turn back." He shook his head, muttering to himself. No. He was close to the end of this stretch of road. He could make it. The convoy didn't respond, just loomed in silence, holding their steady watch behind him. Then, as he rounded a curve, a blinding light slashed through the dark. A truck appeared before him, blocking the road, its headlights blazing, bright enough to make him squint. He hit the brakes hard, his rig skidding to a stop just feet from the shadowed figure looming in his path. For a heartbeat, everything stood still. Jake's breath echoed in the cab as he stared up at the ancient rig before him. Its grille was bent and rusted, headlights flickering with a strange, otherworldly glow. Through the grime-streaked windshield, he thought he saw the faint shape of a driver, hollow-eyed, staring back with a gaze that sent chills down his spine. Desperation clawed at him. He glanced back, intending to reverse, but the convoy had closed in, sealing him in. Silent, unyielding, they waited. He was trapped. The radio crackled again, clear and dark, filling the cab with a finality he couldn't shake. "You're one of us now." Jake's blood ran cold as he felt an unnatural chill seep through the cab. He looked down at his dashboard, heart stuttering. The controls looked older, rusted, like they'd aged decades in an instant. He touched the seat. It felt rough, cracked, like worn leather. A horrifying thought gripped him. He looked down at his hands, wrapped in fingerless gloves he'd never owned. His skin was pale, lined with age like he'd aged overnight. With a shiver of horror, he looked up at the rearview mirror. The face that stared back wasn't his own. It was hollow, gaunt, a stranger's face, someone who had haunted these roads for decades. One by one the trucks faded, their headlights disappearing into the night. Only he and the truck before him remained, leading him onward, back into the empty road. Jake knew then that he'd never leave this highway. He was bound to it now. Tom Grady was no stranger to night drives. Years on the road had taught him to appreciate the quiet of the highways under the stars, where it was just him, the hum of his rig, and the distant call of the road. But tonight felt different. The air seemed thicker, almost alive, as if the night itself was watching him. He was cutting through a narrow mountain pass in Colorado, trying to make time on a long-haul run. It was the kind of route that felt a little risky at night, but Tom had done it 100 times before. He told himself it was just another drive. Just another night. The clock on his dashboard read 11:59 as he rounded a curve. Ahead, something unusual caught his eye. A bridge. Tom frowned. He'd driven this route for years and had never seen a bridge here before. It was narrow, old-fashioned, and barely visible in the fog that seemed to gather from nowhere. Wooden beams lined its sides, looking weathered and dark as if they'd been there for decades. He slowed the truck, squinting through the windshield, trying to remember if he'd taken a wrong turn. But there it was, plain as day. A single-lane bridge that stretched across a steep gorge, and the GPS? It wasn't showing anything out of the ordinary, as if the bridge didn't even exist. Tom hesitated. Something about it gave him a bad feeling, like an instinct buzzing in the back of his mind. But he was already behind schedule, and he could feel his dispatcher breathing down his neck. With a deep breath, he rolled forward, steering the rig onto the bridge. The wooden planks creaked under the weight of his truck as he moved slowly across, feeling every shift and groan of the bridge under him. Fog drifted in thicker, swirling around the bridge until all he could see was a thin ribbon of wood stretching out ahead, swallowed by gray on both sides. As he made it to the other side, Tom's breath caught in his throat. Ahead of him lay his hometown, or at least, it looked like it. The road continued past an old diner he remembered from years back, with its neon sign glowing faintly. The buildings, the trees, even the layout of the road, it was exactly like the small town he'd grown up in. But something was wrong. It was too quiet. No lights in any of the houses, no movement, no sounds, just the eerie, oppressive silence. Tom rolled through the empty streets, his eyes darting from one familiar landmark to another. The gas station he used to go to as a kid, the park with the broken swing set, the little barber shop with its faded red and white pole. All of it was here just as he remembered it. But it looked frozen, almost like an abandoned movie set, untouched and unchanged. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, a feeling of unease creeping up his spine. He'd been away from home for years, and he knew most of these places had either shut down or been replaced. But here, they looked like they'd been preserved in time. He pulled up to the diner, hoping for some sign of life. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a dull glow over the parking lot. He killed the engine and climbed out, stepping cautiously toward the door. Inside, the place was empty. Booths lined the walls. Tables were set, but there was no one around. A thick layer of dust covered everything, as if it hadn't been touched in years. Tom's footsteps echoed in the silence as he moved deeper inside. Tom's pulse quickened. Then he saw it. He glanced around, feeling like he was being watched. Steaming hot, sitting on the counter. He took a cautious step back, almost colliding with a figure that seemed to appear out of nowhere. It was an older man, dressed in a worn-out flannel shirt and jeans. His face was strangely blank, almost as if he was half asleep. The man looked at Tom, tilting his head slightly. "Tom Grady, you finally made it?" the man said in a low, raspy voice. Tom felt a chill race down his spine. He had no idea who this man was, but the familiarity in his voice was unsettling. "Do I know you?" Tom asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man gave a faint smile. We've met, in a way. Everyone who takes the bridge eventually does. We all come back. Home. Come back? What are you talking about? Tom backed away, feeling for the door behind him. But the man just looked at him with that same half-smile. It's where we all end up, Tom. All of us who couldn't find our way. Tom stumbled out of the diner, his heart racing. He looked around, expecting to see some familiar faces or signs of life, but there was only silence. He climbed back into his truck and turned the key, desperate to get out of this strange version of his hometown. The engine sputtered, groaned, and then fell silent. No amount of turning the key brought it back to life. He pounded the steering wheel in frustration. The clock on his dash blinked midnight. Taking a deep breath, Tom opened the door and climbed out, staring at the empty town. It looked more desolate by the second, as if shadows were closing in around him, swallowing the light from the diner. Then he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, seeing figures slowly emerging from the fog. Men, mostly, all with the same blank, distant look in their eyes. They walked toward him in eerie silence, as if drawn to him by some invisible force. Tom backed away, nearly tripping as he reached the edge of the street. What? What do you want? One of the men stepped forward, his eyes dark and hollow, almost inhuman. We're the ones who didn't make it across, stuck on this road forever. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he took another step back. No, this can't be real. I just need to turn around. Get back on the bridge. You crossed at midnight, the man said, his voice distant. There's no going back. Desperation clawed at Tom as he broke into a run, trying to find the bridge, to escape this nightmare town. But every turn brought him back to the same diner, the same empty street, the same ghostly figures watching him. He finally found himself back in front of his truck, breathing heavily, his mind racing for a solution. In a last attempt, he climbed back into the cab, grabbed his radio, and called out, "This is Tom Grady. Anyone out there? I need help." For a moment there was nothing but static. Then faintly, a voice crackled through. "Tom Grady, you finally made it." It was his own voice. The realization hit him like a blow. He was part of this place now, just like the others. He'd driven the bridge at midnight, crossed into his own past, his own memories, and now he was trapped, doomed to relive it forever. In one last, desperate act, he turned to his rearview mirror, hoping for some sign of the bridge. But instead, he saw his own face, older, more worn, with hollow eyes that stared back at him, as if he'd been there for decades. The headlights of his truck dimmed, casting him in darkness. And as the last light faded, Tom understood that he'd become one of them, another silent figure waiting for the next lost driver to cross the midnight bridge. The road stretched out in front of Mac Jones like a black ribbon under the stars. He'd been driving long-haul routes for years and had seen just about everything. But nothing had ever unnerved him like the stories about Exit 17. Truckers swapped tales about that exit all the time, stories of drivers who'd taken it and never come back. It was a ghost story among truckers, a campfire tale told over late-night coffees and cigarettes. Mac didn't believe it, of course. There was no such thing as a cursed exit. It was just an old highway rumor. But on that night, he found himself on the very stretch of highway where Exit 17 lay waiting. It was well after midnight, and his eyes were heavy. The idea of a quick detour to shake himself awake didn't sound so bad. Besides, he thought with a smirk, he wasn't superstitious. As he approached the sign, a feeling of unease crept over him. The green reflective letters glinted in his headlights. Exit 17. The arrow pointed down a narrow, barely lit road that curved into a patch of thick trees. Nothing to it, he muttered to himself, taking the turn. The exit ramp wound downward, twisting like a spiral into the dark. Mac had to slow down to navigate the sharp curves, the shadows closing in tight around his rig. The road felt rough under his wheels, old and cracked, as if it hadn't been driven on in years. When he finally reached the bottom, the exit opened onto a straight, narrow road flanked by dense woods on both sides. The GPS showed nothing but empty space around him, no towns or signs of life. He shrugged it off and drove forward, figuring he'd rejoin the main highway in a few miles. As he drove, Mac noticed that the trees on either side of the road seemed oddly uniform. They were tall and dark, stretching high into the night, their branches reaching across the road as if they wanted to pull him in. He glanced in his side mirrors but saw only the same eerie, endless stretch of forest behind him. After what felt like 20 minutes, he started to get frustrated. He should have hit another road by now. The GPS still showed nothing but empty space. Mac felt a bead of sweat trickle down his neck. "Come on, just a little farther," he muttered, trying to shake the unease gnawing at him. Then he saw it, up ahead, just barely visible in the darkness. A green sign identical to the one he'd seen before. Exit 17. Mac slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. It didn't make any sense. He hadn't turned, hadn't looped back. He'd been driving in a straight line. And yet here he was, right back where he started. He forced a nervous laugh. "All right, funny joke, universe. I'm just tired, that's all. Must have missed a turn somewhere." Determined, he put the truck back in gear and drove forward, refusing to believe he was lost. But as he kept driving, the forest around him didn't change. The trees looked exactly the same, dark, tall, and closing in. The road was dead straight, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was curving in on itself somehow. Minutes ticked by, and then he saw it again. Exit 17. The same sign, glowing in the dim light of his headlights, taunting him. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. Something was wrong. He wasn't just tired. He was trapped. Mac took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He pulled the truck to the side of the road and turned off the engine, sitting in silence. He told himself he'd wait a few minutes, get his bearings, maybe try to call for help. He picked up the CB radio. "This is Big Mac. Anyone out there?" His voice echoed in the empty cab, but only static replied. "Come on, anyone out there? This is Big Mac. Need a hand here." "Come on, anyone out there? This is Big Mac. Need a hand here." Just static. He clicked it off, his pulse quickening. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that there was something out there in the darkness, just beyond the glow of his headlights. Suddenly, a flash of light caught his eye. Up ahead, on the other side of the road, another truck was parked, its cab lights glowing faintly. He hadn't seen it when he first pulled over. Relief flooded him as he climbed out of his truck and walked over. "Hey, need a hand out here," he called, hoping the driver might help him find his way back. But as he got closer, his steps slowed. The truck looked ancient, covered in dust and rust, as if it had been sitting there for years. The cab door hung open and Mac could see the interior. Old, faded, almost fossilized, like something from another time. A chill ran down his spine, but he forced himself to call out again. "Hello? Anyone there?" Only silence. Then he noticed something odd. A faint set of footprints led away from the truck, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. They looked fresh, recent, like someone had just been there. Mac felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. He knew he should turn back, get in his truck, and drive. But curiosity gnawed at him. He followed the footprints a few steps, peering into the darkness, trying to see where they led. But there was nothing. Just trees, stretching into the blackness. Then he heard a voice. A faint, low whisper drifting from somewhere deep in the woods. "Turn back, before it's too late." Mac spun around, heart racing, but saw no one. The air was thick, silent. It was as if the forest itself had spoken. Shaken, he hurried back to his truck, climbed inside and locked the doors. He started the engine and took off, determined to get out of there no matter what it took. But as he drove, the same eerie feeling crept over him. The road hadn't changed. The trees were still there, just as dark and tall as before. He glanced at the dashboard clock. It hadn't moved, frozen at the same minute he'd first seen the sign. Then up ahead, the familiar green glow appeared. Exit 17. Mac's heart sank. He was back again. In a panic, he floored the accelerator, the engine roaring as he tried to outrun the loop. He sped down the road, but every minute felt like an eternity, and no matter how far he drove, the forest never changed. When the sign appeared again, he slammed on the brakes, his hands shaking. This time, he didn't try the CB. He knew no one would answer. He just sat there, staring at the sign, feeling the weight of the road press. He realized then that the stories were true. He'd taken the cursed exit, the one that trapped drivers forever in an endless loop, and now he was part of it. As he sat there, a new set of headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. Another truck, pulling up slowly behind him. He watched as the driver, a shadowed figure he couldn't quite see, climbed out, looking around with the same confused, uneasy expression he'd had just hours before. Mac wanted to call out, to warn him, to tell him to turn back, but he knew it was useless. The road had taken him, and now it was about to claim another. And as he sat there, feeling the weight of the darkness closing in, he knew one thing for certain. No one ever left Exit 17. Do you dare to face the unknown? Subscribe now for more chilling stories that will keep you awake at night. Hit the bell icon, because the next nightmare might just be yours.